Well, good morning and welcome to another episode of I'm Doing This to Myself. And that always makes me laugh when I remember that I'm doing it to myself. I mean, if you didn't have the alternative, you wouldn't laugh, you'd be like completely depressed. But once you realise that there are principles and applications of principles that you can employ in your life to free yourself from the cycles of errant thought or the cycles of miscreative thinking that you use, or that you probably unbeknowingly use to get yourself in the shit all the time, it's really nice. There was a point in my life actually when I could see that I was my own worst enemy and I didn't know what to do about it. So when A Course in Miracles came along, it was a big relief. And at that time in my life, I was heavily into drugs and alcohol, whatever I could get. It didn't really matter. And anything to stave off that inner sense of anxiety, that existential angst that comes from the ignorance about life. You know, the ignorance of not knowing why I'm in the world, why the world is the way it is, and all that sort of thing. And you might think, well, it's easy enough to avoid looking at the world and why it is the way it is and everything else like that, but you can't really, because it's something that just shows up in life. Doesn't matter whether you ran away to a hippie commune and whatever, there would still be bureaucracy and everything within that framework. And I did that with the Rainbow Tribe many years ago. And there's a council and there's, it just doesn't work. And you have to be very aware, very self-aware and very tolerant and patient if you want to be involved in something like that, with the understanding that, what are you trying to run away from? What are you trying to escape? And when it comes to drugs and alcohol are an escape. And so we talk about the addiction to drugs and the addiction to alcohol. And probably everybody knows somebody who just likes a little bit on the weekend to help them finish the week, and that sort of thing. Just likes a few drinks on a Friday night and whatever, and that's fine. Most people can manage and tolerate a small amount of everything, and everything in moderation. But there is a small percentage of people who will use drugs and alcohol as a crutch, right? And they'll deny that they use it as a crutch to cover up their denial of the fact that they feel completely uncomfortable in the world. And that's something that you don't realise you feel until you actually come to terms with it. And that's one of the things that I love about AA and Course in Miracles and things like that. It explains to you completely why you feel completely like a fish out of water in the world. And why you turn to coping mechanisms such as drugs and alcohol to help get by, and why then that becomes an addiction, when it may originally have just started off as something, as a social a social activity. But the addiction is to anything that alleviates that angst. And I put up a little post this morning, drugs and alcohol, whatever it was, and there was someone who commented shopping. Okay, that might be a way that you something you use to alleviate the angst. And I know it's really cool when you go shopping, right? But and you get a new hat or whatever it is. You can't wait to wear that new hat, so your mind is focused on that new thing. Your mind is distracted for however long the gloss of that new hat lasts. your mind is distracted from its troubles for a second, right? But apart from the fact that it might send you bankrupt, I wouldn't call shopping a particularly addictive behaviour, because like that can transfer to anything. Superficial relationships, you know, I know people that go in and out of relationships or don't have a relationship, they just like that one night stand kind of thing. It alleviates the angst, it alleviates that moment where if you stand still long enough, you'll feel that pressure of the world, you'll feel that emptiness, you'll feel that inner sort of aggravation, and you know, that's what you're always attempting to deal with, always attempting to cover up, always attempting to hide from and to deny. But literally that inner calling, or that inner, some people call it like a splinter in the mind's eye, you know, it's that little needly thing that there's something wrong with the world, there's something not right, and we'll do anything to avoid looking at it, to deny that it's there. It's like, oh no, I'm alright, I just need a drink. I'll have a couple of drinks, I'll be fine. You know, I'll just go for one. So, it's amazing how resilient the human being can be, right? The mind that lives in denial of its pain. Right? It's amazing how diverse the coping mechanisms and the methods we use to avoid looking at our pain, avoid looking at our suffering are. And all suffering and all pain comes from denial of self. Right? And I like that saying, until you love yourself unconditionally, you can't know how to love anyone else unconditionally. And man, that is a process. That is a process. We have to look in that mirror and see not only the things that we like about ourselves, you know, oh, I'm okay, the world's fucked up, because that tends to be the perspective of most people who use drugs and alcohol and whatever to deal with their lives. It's like, man, the world is so unfair, but I'm such a nice person. It's hilarious. It's like, that's the typical human condition, you know. It's like we look at one half of our thought system. We have this dualistic thought system, good, bad, right and wrong, yin, you know, the yin and yang. And we look at all the stuff we like, and oh, everything's perfect, and I'm wonderful, and I'm a child of God, and I'm this, and I'm that, and fuck all those people, all those other people, you know, and I don't want to be like that. It's like, well, how would you know what like that is unless it was thoughts about it in your own mind, and that is causing you the aggravation and the anxiety, because you're projecting it out there into the world and suffering from the result of that. Through your denial of it. You can't escape it, because you take your mind with you everywhere you go, and it's going to show up for you. What you resist persists. It's going to show up for you as a confrontational or a triggering or a button pushing or whatever situation in your own life. Even if you lived alone on a deserted tropical island, something would happen to push your buttons. You run out of coconuts or whatever, you know. But it's a funny thing. So the idea of the Kraken is one that I like, and I've just sort of come into this lately. I'm developing this kind of analogy for life as being like a Kraken. And you're fighting the Kraken. Anyone who doesn't know what a Kraken is, it's like the giant octopus of the deep sea that sucks down sailing ships and eats all the sail, like massive mega octopus. And the tentacles come up around the boat, and the sailors hack at the tentacles with their swords. But the tentacles on an octopus can regrow, and they will regrow, because it's the nature of the beast. But you have to hack off the head. You get that? So the situations in a person's life will reform and remanifest again and again and again as those tentacles that annoy you and try to drag you under. And you can try to deal with the tentacles all you like, but until you go to the head, and the tentacles may eventually get you, but until you go to the head and hack off the head, it's just going to keep going, right? And the rule of life here on earth is that a lesson will repeat until it is learned, and all things are lessons, right? In the journey of the soul, all things are lessons, and you are on a journey of the soul. If you've got a better explanation for what you're doing here, inbox me. I'd love to know about it. It's so funny. And you can prove all this stuff to yourself through experimenting with your own thought cycles. Look at what's going on in there. The same thoughts that you have every time you react or respond to a situation that shows up again and again. Every time another one of those cracking tentacles shows up as a shit relationship or a hard day at work or whatever, look at what you do in your mind as the swinging of the sword. Do you go and get a drink? Do you shoot up? I don't know if anyone shoots up anymore. It was all heroin back in when I was a young fella, but I don't know what it is today. Ice. So, like cutting the head off the Kraken in your own life is tackling the question of your own place, your own reality, your own point of existence, right? Your own reason for being here, head on. And if you were to just stand around and look at the place and wonder why you're here, why am I in the world? What's the purpose of getting a job and retiring and dying and, working my whole life? That's pointless. I agree with you, that's pointless. But there is a purpose that can be seen in everything. So in that sense, it's not, there is purpose, and it's not pointless, but and healing is that purpose. But until you tackle the head of the Kraken head on, until you look at the meaning of life, why you're here, what it's all about, and go straight to the core of all your anxiety, of all your problems, of all which manifest as those tentacles that all seem to be different coming at you from every side. It's the same beast, right? It's the same thing. It's the same aggravation showing up as lots of different things from different directions. So answering the question for yourself, what am I? Why am I here? What is the meaning of life? All of these things, that's attacking the head or going at the head. You're going to wear yourself out, with the tentacles. So it's a tough one because I remember from my own history that there was a place in there in my mind where I thought drugs are great. I used to think if I could just stay sedated for long enough, and I made the decisions in my life during that time around my self-perceived ability to be able to stay stoned or high or whatever the state was I was in. And it's like, and I felt within myself that as long as I had my drugs, I could cope. And that was I remember thinking that way. That was a real place. It was like a real point of strength in me. But it was a catalyst. Drugs are just a catalyst. They're just not a catalyst. They're just a crutch. So if you find that you're using drugs to deal with life, take a good look at what life is to you. Define it. What is life? Why should my life be like this, that I feel like I need to use drugs to manage with it and cope with it? what is it about life that, and you got to go beyond the superficial sense of things. You can't just skim off the surface. You got to be willing to look deeply. What is it that I'm afraid of? What is it that disturbs me? That existential anxiety, that deep anxiety, and it just shows up out of nowhere. It's like your life is like a, you know, when you're an addict, when you're stuck on the shit, you know, your life is like in a massive, never-ending pregnant pause. You know, when you go to a party and everybody's chit-chatting away and all of a sudden it goes quiet and no one knows what to say, and there's that incredible sort of like, oh my God, do I get up and leave the thing and whatever, or the group, or do I say something? What do I say? And there's that anxiety, and it gets to the point and then it's too late to say anything. And you offer it, you know, anyone like a drink? Anyone want to smoke some weed or whatever? And it's like, no, that's no way to live your life. That's just terrible. You know, and I'm glad I got out of that cycle of thinking alive, actually. So. All right, well, I've had a few people come to me in the last couple of weeks. I had two lovely ladies, both mothers of children who are dependent on drugs to manage their life and all that sort of thing, come to me in the last couple of weeks, and I've started them off with the workbook of A Course in Miracles, and for their own progress, for their own what would you call it, to enable them to become self-empowered within themselves and find themselves. I mean, that's the journey of life. You've got to find yourself here. If you're trying to avoid it, trying to deny life through the use of drugs, deny what's knocking on your door. I don't have to look at this today, I'll do it tomorrow. You know. But it's such a heavy subject, you know. The suffering and the havoc that drugs and alcohol wreak through a community, through a family. It's like really all for the sake of answering a very simple question about oneself. You know, this is why I'm doing the Yellow Paper Project. It's like, I saw recently a thing called Be You, which is a little program that Beyond Blue is running in primary schools, and I think that's fantastic that something like that is starting to happen. And I think there's 6,000 schools in Australia starting this little Be You project through Beyond Blue. Or was it 60,000 schools? Anyway, it was a big amount of schools, and I'm sure that 60% anyway of primary schools are now doing this thing. And I'm trying to stimulate activity within the primary school sector to open that even further, you know, to include deeper and higher levels of self-awareness for kids that they can understand at their age, you know, at their level. That will put the notion of know thyself back on the dinner table discussion, you know, menu, you know, something that people talk about, and I'm doing a terrible job of trying to explain this today. But the ability for someone to find themselves and to know themselves and stuff is only going to be as pertinent as the availability of information for them to you know, that they can find. And if it's not taught to our kids, if it's not available through our schools where kids spend most of their time, and through our shopping centres and through our places where public gather, you know, back in medieval times, if you wanted to know what was going on, you had to go and listen to the town crier and things like that. But these days we've got social media, and we've got these sort of networking chains of networking potential, I call it, you know, that we could use, such as schools and libraries and shopping centres and places like that. And they're wasted, really. We've become too enamoured with the superficial factors of life, how many cars we have, and how nice our house is, and how big our TVs are. And it's not fulfilling. That kind of mentality doesn't fulfill us within. It doesn't feed our soul. It doesn't give us any hope. So we turn to things to avoid our pain. We turn to things to avoid that hole that that our hope for our future could fulfill. And it's really piss poor. But anyway, things are changing slowly. Consciousness is rising up, and more and more people are awakening to the light of truth. And that being that the truth is within you, and if you do seek it, it will set you free. If you do find it within you, your life will change because of it. You won't suffer from that inner emptiness of not knowing what you are, why you're here, all of those sorts of things. We need to teach that to our kids from the time they're little babies. And there's a lovely book by an author called Neil Donald Walsh, W-A-L-S-H, I think, or C-H. Neil Donald Walsh, called Little Soul Son, which he wrote for kids, explaining the journey of the soul and the lessons and the understandings that we're here on earth to gain, you know, to have. And, you know. Anyway, it's a really heavy subject, you know. It brings a lot of it's like one of the things that my teacher used to always say, or one of my teachers used to always say at the end of every talk, was, God bless us all, each and every one. And really, you know. Okay.